Welcome to the afternoon work session of the Hampton City Council. I'd like to ask the clerk to please call the roll.
Councilwoman Brown.
Present.
Councilman Brown.
Here.
Councilwoman Curtis.
Present.
Vice Mayor Gray.
Present.
Councilman Hobbs.
Present.
Councilwoman Sneed.
Here.
Mayor Tuck.
Mayor Tuck is traveling today and will not be able to join us for this meeting. And so with that, I'd like to ask the city manager to introduce the first item.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As you know, Council has continued to track the traffic management concerns that we have in Phoebus and in downtown. And earlier this year, we took steps in downtown to address, in particular, problems with the Settlers Landing Bridge with backups. And that pilot has been pretty successful and has been made more permanent with installation of bollards to try to direct traffic with through traffic and interstate traffic and HU traffic. But the councils continue to ask us to look to see if there's anything else we might be able to do to address the traffic congestion that results from backed up interstate and HRBT tunnels, and in particular focus on the Phoebus area because we haven't been able to do something quite the same and analogous there because we don't have the same number of lanes on Mallory Street. So finally, the mayor had asked that the chief talk about some of their enforcement efforts. HPD does try to enforce these as traffic violations as much as possible, but can't have permanent presence there. And so today what you're going to get is a combined presentation from the Hampton Police Division about some of what they are doing with regard to the traffic congestion enforcement, but also with Public Works. McCord Newsom is here. He's our city engineer to talk about some structural possibilities. So this is a tag team presentation with Chief Salt kicking off.
And it's Vice Mayor and Council, thank you for the opportunity to address this because I know it's a concern for not only Council but the citizens as a whole. There's just so much water you can put through a funnel and into a straw. That's basically what we're trying to deal with. But we also know that the challenges might get even worse as the construction begins. As you know, initially we were informed that there'd be no disruption to traffic on 64, but when you start logically thinking through the process and you think about how much dirt that has to be moved and the trucks that will be coming into and off of the interstate, we know that there's going to be some logical disruptions. And so what we're can't really predict exactly is how much of a disruption is going to impact the side streets that we're talking about here today. But I can tell you that we have been in discussions with VDOT and Police Department with Public Works and Traffic Engineering to try to project this for, I know, at least about 12 to 18 months. But now as plans get more refined, we're running into several issues. What you're going to hear today is the short things that we're doing right now. Some of the intermediate things, the things we're going to do in the short near future, and then some of the evaluation processes that are going to take a little bit longer to see if we can even do or not. But the ideas keep churning, and we know we're going to have to tweak it as we go forward. And we know that it's an issue that we have to manage that we can't resolve. And so if we begin with the end in mind, knowing it's a management issue, not a resolution issue, then it kind of puts us in a better framework of trying to come up with concepts to make it, to ease the pain that everyone suffers with it. As we look at Settlers Road in Phase 1, there's 3 phases. You've already seen some of this stuff starting to take place. Public Works has already put up the bollards. We're starting to see some better markings on the road as opposed to the temporary markings and signage that we've got. Some of that is still going to improve as we go forward. But one of the things that the manager just mentioned and the mayor wanted to hear about was enforcement. These locations are extremely difficult to enforce. And from a police perspective, you'll see the folks in the back of the room in uniform. These are the ones that are primarily responsible for the areas that we're talking about here, from the assistant chief all the way down to Eddie Goss, who is the bid officer in Phoebus, and Sergeant Tommy Brown, who is over the traffic unit, who is coordinating all the issues together from a recommendations perspective. When we look at this, we're using routine patrols of district officers. We're taking proactive measures through directed patrols and special operations such as the traffic unit. And we're using a combination of marked, unmarked cars to handle this. I've also authorized several months ago 2 overtime officers during peak hours. However, I have not mandated that overtime at this point. In other words, forced people to work overtime to do it. We're trying to do it on a voluntary basis, and that's had some mixed reviews. However, as we look at some of the enforcement efforts, you'll see that in just September alone, 30 summons was issued in Settlers Landing Road. Mainly those were for failing to obey traffic signals, and this is like blocking the box, or they're making inappropriate lane changes and things along those lines. Then there's been some auxiliary or some ancillary, should I say, summonses for like registration and inspection. A few accidents, mainly falling too close, rear end kind of things, only 2 angled collisions, and 3 between 6 in the morning and 9 in the morning for unsafe lane change and following too close. This location, you'll see a difference in the number of citations issued in this location rather than the Phoebus area, where there's more citations issued there. This one has a particular problem associated with it, and that's the way you enforce. Because we can observe a violation and they get in that right-hand lane getting ready to get onto the interstate, and for an officer to get behind that vehicle takes some time because of the heavy traffic. And they can't pass other cars because they've got the bollards and everything there, so they have to wait until they can get up and around the other cars to get in behind the violator, and then they have to stop them. And that may occur on that ramp, or it may occur even beyond Mallory Street. When that occurs, the officer either has to go to Mallory Street or has to go to Norfolk, turn around and come back through rush hour traffic to get back in place to issue another citation. Very difficult to do, but we're going to offer some solutions to address that. But that's primarily the difficulty in getting the violators that are blocking the box, that are doing various different things, is one of the problems that we deal with there. But we do have an idea that I'll get to in just a minute. In contrast, when you look at the Phoebus area, Eddie Gauze has done a great job there. And this is a very dangerous situation. Both these locations are very dangerous. You will see, I think, in one of the photos, how tight it is. It's one lane. You stop a car, you disrupt further traffic when you stop a car there, and then the officer has to get out and talk to the violator, and all it takes is one brief second of somebody looking at a cell phone, and we've got an officer in the hospital, because they'll veer over and hit the officer, and there's really only inches to spare there. And so that is a problem. Officer safety is a big issue. But even working through those issues, in September, 94 summons were issued, and you can see the numbers for the various different types, and in October there have been 78 summonses issued. We've really only seen about 5 crashes, one lane change, and 4 angles. A lot of these violations we're dealing with are turn violations, as I think if anybody's been down there and you see the public works signage that has gone up, these are some of the sign violations that we're seeing there. So there has been, even with the constraints that we have, a good bit of enforcement that has gone on since we've been addressing this issue. There are some things that the traffic unit, Sergeant Brown, has recommended after getting out there and studying this. And we work in concert with traffic engineering throughout this whole process, because there's 3 ways that we deal with any kind of problem like that. And it's education, engineering, and enforcement. It's those 3 things that come together, called the 3 E's. And so engineering and enforcement are 2 of the things we're working on, and also education through social media, through the signage and things along those lines. But Sergeant Brown has recommended a few things that we're still in discussions with, but we expect to not run into too much controversy on most of them. Reduce the speed to 25 miles an hour should be pretty straightforward to do. There are some broken lines where the pylons are placed. They should be solid white lines from an enforcement perspective. Some additional road markings, like you saw in the one photo where you have I-64 painted on the roadway. Well, that's actually on the other side of the bridge where you're already committed into the lanes. What we'd like to do is see some of those on the approach to the bridge, more on the Eaton side of the bridge. And so we're working on some discussions there. One of the big things that might help is that we have folks who get at the last minute and they just want to drive over the pylons and because they're plastic and merge into a lane. It's being suggested that we have some raised medians where the pylons are to assist in discouraging those, and also put no U-turn signs on Harvey Way at Emancipation Drive, because we have vehicles going in there, turn around and making a U-turn. One of the biggest issues we have with backing up traffic into downtown is that probably, and I've talked with the sergeant, I've been out there and sat for several hours and watched, probably 80% or more of the vehicles coming off of the interstate at Settlers Landing are merging right back into the right-hand lane and getting right back onto the interstate. They're just trying to hopscotch a few of the cars to get back out there. That's an awful lot. And then you get into where they're blocking the box or blocking the intersection during a red light change, and that line that's coming through from downtown over the bridge just sits. And that encourages students and other folks trying to get into Hampton University or the VA hospital to come up the far left-hand lane and make a right-hand turn across 2 through lanes to get into the school area, the Harbor Apartments, or go over towards the VA. So these are all challenges that we're dealing with. As we transition towards phase 2, we start talking about some closures, but I did want to leave you with a thought of what the raised medians might look like from a suggested perspective. This is all in the engineering side, and they will require some discussions. Where you see this is the current setup that we have, with a few suggestions of the painted lines and that sort of thing. If you've been out there recently, you will see that the bollards already require a right-hand turn in that far right-hand lane going into the school. And traffic in there, it's pretty intuitive once you get into it, but a little better signage, a little work needs to be tweaked there, and we'll probably be tweaking for quite some time till we get to where we want to be. There are some other phases that we're starting to look at. We are working with traffic engineering and evaluating the red light cameras. We're working with legal on that as well, on whether or not we can use red light cameras for blocking the box, which we now know you cannot do. We can only use red light cameras for actually entering an intersection after the light has become a steady red. And there are some significant steps that we have to follow to make sure that we're doing that appropriately. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to McCord, and of course there'll be opportunities to ask questions of us all, including my staff, if you would like, a little later.
Thank you, Chief. Good afternoon, Council. As the Chief said, we have done quite a bit of work, certainly on the Settlers Landing Road portion of this issue. We are looking at the red light cameras, as he mentioned. We were hoping to be able to use the red light cameras to enforce the do not block this box signage that we have up now, but we have learned that's probably not going to happen. There was a pilot program done out in Washington State. We could not find the results of that program, but this is not something that is being done widely across the country. So some additional research will certainly need to be done there before we implement the red light camera to enforce the do not block the box. Pros and cons of this. Pros, it does provide enforcement without impeding traffic. It certainly would provide an added deterrent from folks blocking the box. These areas are in the intersection itself. We're finding that with the lane delineators, folks are using the intersection to change lanes. And as the Chief said, it's been very difficult to enforce that with your typical police officer. Could add some additional revenue, although not sure on that. We know there are third parties out there that offer this type of service as far as the billing aspect of it. But whether or not we would generate enough revenue to cause them to have interest in this, it's just not sure at this time. Cons is there is an initial investment here. You're talking potentially $100,000 per intersection. And if you add up the intersections on Settlers Landing and down in the Phoebus area, there is a significant number. Most likely it would be outsourced. Again, if we can generate revenue, we might get some interest from a third party, maybe not. Requires additional full-time police officer, which, again, that's additional cost. The other item that I would like to talk about today is potential ramp closures. This is something that we thought would be very effective at deterring these folks that are hopping off the interstate and wanting to come through downtown or Phoebus to avoid backups on the interstate. We have had some discussion with VDOT concerning this, and they were very seemingly agreeable when we first talked to them, but were very clear that it would need to happen on city property, not VDOT-owned right-of-way. After doing some research, and maybe they had already done their research, we're finding that at the Settlers Landing Road on-ramp, the eastbound on-ramp, and over at Mallory at the eastbound on-ramp, and at the location just beyond the westbound ramp that we were considering as a gate location, that right-of-way, best we can tell as of today, is owned by the state. So that's going to be a problem. They did tell us that Federal Highway, there was no way they would approve this. We thought about approaching VDOT again about conveying us an easement or actually conveying that right-of-way if it really hasn't happened. Chances of them giving us right-of-way, knowing what our intentions are, is probably slim at this point. We haven't given up on this option. We feel it would be effective if we were to close those gates, maybe in the AM peak and the PM peak. I think that would deter a lot of these folks from using downtown and Phoebus to get onto 64.
Excuse me. Do you happen to have a pointer from there that you could show the locations and I guess where the separation between the state VDOT right-of-way and the cities?
Which one?
This one here. One at the top.
Right there?
Yeah.
Nope.
You hit the buttons. Just press.
You know what? It might be easier for me to just point to it. Because I don't know that I can see the point. Basically, this is the Settlers Landing 64 intersection. This is the eastbound on-ramp. We would put a gate here that's shown in green or yellow, and a gate there. To basically block access to 64 at this location. The problem is, at this point, VDOT built that portion of Settlers Landing Road. They applied the right-of-way. It doesn't look like it was conveyed to the city. We need some follow-up on that. They do the document out there, we have to be able to run these on. We will continue to research that to see if there's any way we can get that right-of-way. Or maybe that right-of-way has been conveyed to us and we just haven't found the documentation to support that. As you move over to the Mallory Street side, this is the I-64 East on-ramp. We were talking about installing a gate at this location here, which would basically block the ramp. Again, that's going to deter a lot of these folks from coming through Phoebus or through the university and the VA to get on 64 to avoid the backups. Again, that right-of-way acquired by VDOT as part of the 64 project. Same thing here. This gate would be installed just beyond. This is the westbound on-ramp to 64. This is Mallory coming south. We would install a gate here, although this gate, I don't know how effective this would be without that gate as well, because cars can bypass this and still get onto the on-ramp. Again, this gate is in VDOT-owned property or state-owned property at this point, to the best of our knowledge. We will continue to look at that to to see if there's any way we can say that was potentially in the old Mallory Street right-of-way that came through here. For a first look at that, looks like it's too far north, but more research is needed. Thank you.
Councilwoman Sneed.
Well, as someone who goes over on the south side frequently, if in fact we were able to do that, how would I access the interstate from the east side of the city if you're going to block them off
Right.
like that?
If you were trying to go East 64, say in the PM between, whatever time we decided that the gates would come down, you would most likely have to go back to the LaSalle 64 intersection. That's going to be your closest on-ramp. Our thought is a lot of people will start using that, and then we'll have more folks getting on at the Mercury 64 intersection as well, which is much better designed and can handle a much larger traffic volume than either one of these locations downtown.
Vice Mayor and Council, one of the things that I omitted when I was talking is one of the solutions for the enforcement side of things, right in that Settlers Landing area and Phoebus area. And the pictures that you see here from 3 different police agencies of might as well just call them dirt bikes or kind of Duro bikes. They're street and off-road vehicles. They're they're like bicycles on steroids, if you will. It would allow officers to get in behind vehicles much easier, much quicker, without having to wait and go around through traffic. We've already identified the funding thanks to the city manager and the assistant city managers, and we are in the procurement process of 4 of these to test. And the nice thing about them, they're very versatile. We can use them for beaches. We can use them for the new walkway across New Market Creek area and all for patrolling areas that we typically would not be easy to get into. Basically, it's about $10,000 per bike, and officers would wear the regular uniform with maybe some enhanced boots.
Okay, are there any questions for council members?
Mr. Vice Mayor, one thing we wanted to see today, coming out of today's conversation, is whether there's any interest in us pursuing the red light camera option. And what that would mean is that we would start to contact the vendors and see if there would be an outsourced relationship that could work. That's typically how the red light cameras have been done. I know, for instance, in Newport News, that is an outsourced contract where the vendor manages the cameras and puts the upfront capital investment but gets paid over time through the collection of the fees that are charged. We could see if there is interest or if it's something we would need to do on our own. And then if it is something we would do on our own, how we might look at that if it's a $100,000 investment per intersection. But if there's no appetite for doing red light cameras, I wouldn't want to waste staff time on that at all. So that was one thing. I mean, we don't have to vote on it today. There's certainly a lot more work and research that needs to be done, but we typically don't have staff invest that energy in staff work if there's not an interest in doing it.
Councilwoman Sneed.
Going back to your presentation, you said that we can't use the red light cameras for blocking the intersection. Is that correct? Unless you're at a red light and you're
Unless you enter the intersection itself or enter the box after the light has turned red.
You cannot use it. Okay. Now, is that state law?
Yes, that's what's allowed currently under state law.
Under state law.
Yes, and we did research that before the presentation.
Okay, so is there a possibility well, I'm sure you can if you lobby enough.
If we don't like the law, we can try to get it changed.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, well, at this time, if you're trying to gauge desire for doing it, I mean, to me, using the red light camera is not going to stop what's happening now, so I certainly wouldn't support spending the money to do it. If we could use it for blocking the blocked area, that's one thing, but no.
I will say, though, the way you get the blocked box is that someone has gone into that intersection with the red light. So while you're not enforcing blocked box per se, you get blocked boxes when people enter the intersection after a red light typically. So it wouldn't be a block the box you're enforcing, it's a red light you're enforcing, but you would get some portion of that through the people who are going through the red light.
But may I interject for just a second? I don't think that anything that we're doing here is going to be the magic wand that's going to solve any of the problem, as I said before. I do think that every little thing that we do can help if we're smart about it. And I'm not one that wants to advocate more time on staff, but one of the things that we might want to consider is, does it cost us anything? From a police department perspective, an additional officer is a problem. But we can talk with our sister city who does red light cameras, see what kind of an impact it has on staff to review all of those. And then it's all about the return on the investment. Is there enough violations that would cause a vendor to want to come in and finance the cameras themselves, but keeping in mind that those fees and stuff would have to offset the cost of what they have in it and all. And so it's not going to be a revenue producer, and I wouldn't advocate revenue producing, but it's about how many little things can we do to make things better, if that makes any sense. If it costs us something, that's one thing. If it doesn't cost us anything, it's something else.
Have we done any type of analysis to see how many people, in fact, do that, block the intersection? And
well, the thing I think that makes the manager a little skeptical, me a little skeptical on whether it's going to be a return on investment, I don't want to speak for Ms. Bunning, is that we have done an analysis before looking at whether there would be a return on investment, and Sergeant Brown probably knows more about this than I do. But I do remember we did we did about 10 intersections in the city, not just focused in these areas. We looked at Mercury Boulevard and all. The only one that really showed that it would produce or meet the standard was one over at, I believe, Hardy Cash and Executive Center Drive. Even the ones that you would think, like Mercury and Coliseum, didn't meet the standard. So I'm not optimistic that we would find that it's going to entice a vendor to come in. But, you just never know.
so we're talking about red lights throughout the city, not just in Phoebus.
In fact, a number of years ago, that's what we were doing was looking at red lights. But the law has changed a little bit. We don't have to it's not as sterner for state approval as it was then. But we were looking at the number of violations, and we just didn't see the thresholds that were needed. But we weren't in the situation that we have now, where we have all that traffic. And I can tell you, whether I'm sitting there in my car with the blue lights on or off, people are making violations. It's just, can you get to them to issue the citation is the issue.
So just for a little bit of clarity, when we looked at it before citywide, the only thing that we could look at was the accident record.
Correct. Because
that was the then state law emphasis. The state law now has language that looks to not just safety and accident data, but also, and I'm not going to remember the exact verbiage right now, but the repetitive traffic violations that the police officers have difficulty enforcing. So that's why we thought Phoebus might be a good pilot to look at this additional application of the red light cameras. I don't know. I'd have to look, but I don't think we even looked at a Phoebus intersection back when we were looking at the other data. And what makes Phoebus potentially, and we don't know if a vendor would find it worthwhile or not, is that we have so much traffic going through Phoebus today that we didn't when we looked at this years ago. The downside to that, even though you got all that traffic, is it's moving relatively slow. So typically and I'm just using a Newport News example, in like Oyster Point area or Jefferson, it's not necessarily the slowness of the traffic that has people go through the red light. They're just not paying attention. Here, there's a slow movement. People get frustrated. They want to keep moving. They sometimes go through that red light. So it's not like, it may not be enough violations that would warrant the vendor investment, but we thought it was worth looking at because, again, you get those blocked intersections because somebody is going through a red light nevertheless.
Yeah, there are 4 items that we have to meet from the new state law, and we're fairly confident that we could meet those from a state approval perspective simply because of the dynamics going on there. But it's just as the manager just stated.
Okay. Well, I'll say this, that I would only support it if we don't have to pay for it.
Councilman Brown.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Chief, and others who are making presentations. Have we considered any type of dummy cameras in that area? And the reason I'm making that suggestion is because I remember recently here I was traveling somewhere and I saw a police vehicle. It was in an area where, folks were speeding and all, but no one was in the vehicle. But just me seeing that, I wasn't speeding. Let me clarify that. But just seeing that.
He didn't catch you anyway because he wasn't in the car.
Just seeing that vehicle there was a deterrent.
Yes.
And I do know that dummy cameras have been successful in some areas. I don't know if that's a deterrent, because I think one of the things we have to begin to look at is how cost prohibitive, how we reduce some of the cost of doing some of these things. Let's at the lowest cost first to see if they're effective. If not, then we can certainly look at red light cameras. I'm not supporting red light cameras at this point because I don't know enough about red light cameras. And I do know, too, they have to be able to pay for themselves at some point based on the number of traffic and folks going through that particular intersection or whatever. So have we considered any type of dummy cameras there?
Without going into specific tactics, yes, and I'll be glad to talk with you on the side, but not in the way that you're thinking that, we have like a camera sitting on the side of the road and it flashes. No, we have not considered that. Something we might could consider, but I'll be glad to brief you on some of the things that we are doing that save resources and all that create deterrence and creates an environment that enhance the perception of risk of becoming a violator or being issued a ticket.
Councilwoman Curtis.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Just sort of piggyback on Councilman Brown's suggestion, my thought was, can we just put up the signs? With no cameras. Just put up the signs that there are cameras there. So I can talk with you about that.
I'll consult legal on that.
Yeah, I just, to follow on what Councilman Brown is saying about deterrence. If people think they're on camera, they behave a little differently than if they don't believe there's anything. And because the traffic is so slow there, there would be, I think from a driver perspective, there would be a better, perception that there might be some consequence.
To back up what Councilman Brown and you're saying is that before the technology evolution and Ring cameras and doorbell cameras and all of that, there were a number of studies done, and I'm an old guy in policing, as you know, but there were a number of studies that showed that whether you had a burglar alarm really didn't matter that much about whether you prevented a burglary, but a sign could do as much or more than the burglar alarm did. So there is some potential there.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so thank you. I'm not crazy. Is that what you're saying? Thank you, Chief. I appreciate that.
Councilwoman Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. I wonder if there are some other things that we should explore. One, I think we've already discussed, which is entering into discussions with these various apps that are directing people off the interstate. I think the city manager was going to see if we could approach the Waves and the Google Maps and whoever else, and so I'd like to hear an update on that if that's possible. But lots of people have learned their way around now. They don't even need the app to know how to get around. And so I wonder if it's possible to put signage on 64 that says how many minutes it is, like they have for other routes, that if you're going to the beach in Nags Head or something and it's this many minutes to go 664 and this many minutes to go 64, could we have signage that says, it's this many minutes to the tunnel on the interstate and it's this many more minutes if you're going through, Settlers Landing or whatever your in-town route is, because I think that folks learn that you really can't go faster by going through Phoebus and downtown. So maybe it's possible that a computer can figure that and notify the public. It also might remind people that it's not going to be faster. And thirdly, with respect to the education component, I wonder if we reached out to Hampton University if we could just have just a town hall or something with the students to share with them some of their concerns about safety, for their own safety. I think, the students are being caught in this on the Settlers Landing Road because they're trying to go back to the university, and they have to wait in the line to get to turn. And if they're in the far lane, and I've observed traffic making that right turn across 2 lanes of traffic, it's so dangerous. And hopefully we can help educate folks in all of our outreach that you're better off just being patient and waiting in line and getting where you're going safely. Just some thoughts.
Councilman Brown.
Yeah, since we're thinking out of the box here, Chief, has there been any discussion maybe with state police or what type of relationship do we have with Hampton University Police to maybe help us with some enforcement?
Well, I don't think we've had a discussion with Hampton University about enforcement except on game days and when we have enhanced traffic issues for events. We work very closely with them during that. We do talk with them about educational exchanges of information. We can perhaps enhance that. It's an excellent idea. And with the state police, their primary interest is the interstate.
Sure. Yeah.
They are aware, and we have been talking with them. They're aware of our concerns, but, when we have these meetings, it's VDOT and everybody sitting at the table, and, they have their concerns and priorities, we have our concerns and priorities, and they have, limited staff as well. So I don't see a lot of relief from the state police on the side roads. So the interstate's a different issue.
Mr. Vice Mayor, in response to Councilwoman Brown's inquiries, I want to say the variable message board about the time is a really good idea. And in fact, it's something that the state has been talking with us about for implementation when they do the hot lanes, because we've been concerned that the hot lanes would actually put even more traffic on the local street. And it's an idea that they had thrown out as a possible way to mitigate that concern. I will confess I hadn't thought about escalating the implementation of that to now, and I will absolutely pursue that with VDOT to see if that's something we could get them to do sooner rather than later. But it was an idea that was an exploration for when all the HRBT work and hot lanes and all that come, and I know they presented to you all a couple meetings ago about that. So escalating it might be a possibility. We have talked extensively with VDOT about a coordinated conversation with the app makers, whether it's Waze or Apple Maps or Google Maps or what have you. They have promised to try to broker that conversation. They said that they've had conversations in the past. Actually, those apps do read into those variable message signs right now. So if we could get the variable ones that you're talking about, it would make the Waze and Apple Map and Google Map conversations easier, because there would be a way to read that into it. But generally speaking, those apps don't much care what happens in the local street, because they see their mission is just helping the driver get somewhere faster, not worrying about the local impact. So we haven't had kind of the success we'd want to have there, but I think your second suggestion actually helps the first suggestion move along faster. So I will make sure we reach out and talk to VDOT about that.
Thank you.
I think the question is, what do we think, or how do we proceed with red light cameras? And I would just add that, looking at the cost, I recall that when we were exploring red light cameras before, we were studying accident data at intersections, and red light cameras were thought to be something that would reduce accidents. And so this doesn't seem to be what we're trying to solve at this intersection. And so for the cost of investing, $100,000 for a camera, plus you got to hire a police officer. If we want to proceed with red light cameras, I'm okay with that, but not just to solve this problem, because I don't think that gets to what we're trying to solve there at the intersection of Mallory and Mellon Street, and then over on Settlers Landing.
Well, it certainly sounds like the consensus of council is to explore some of these other alternatives first, and that's the kind of direction that we needed, so we appreciate that feedback.
Okay. City Manager, did you want to introduce item number 2?
Yes, I think this is the first time our Director of Information Technology, who joined us a little under a year ago, is going to be presenting to you. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Wayne Davis to you. He came to us through the community college system, and he's been a great addition as our Chief Information Officer. We thought it would be very timely and informative both for you and the public to learn about our fiber-based initiatives, really working to expand broadband to city and community facilities. There's a lot of talk on the south side for those folks who follow the Virginia Beach's efforts in broadbanding, and that naturally creates a conversation. Well, what is the peninsula, specifically the city of Hampton, doing to make sure that we're current in digitally transforming our communities? And Dr. Davis and his team have a really solid plan that we wanted to share with you today. This is just in the nature of information. There's no feedback specifically we're looking for from you today. Unless you do have some, by all means, we welcome it. But this is just an information briefing at this time.
Vice Mayor Gray and members of City Council, City Manager Bunting, and City Attorney Ivory, thank you for allowing me to share this information with you. When I first arrived here in Hampton, one of my goals was to look at how we could be a technology hub here in the city. One way to do that, we looked at how we could provide an influx of technology here in the city of Hampton, and one way to do that was to look at how we could connect to the transatlantic cables in Virginia Beach to connect us. So we contracted with a consultant that helped us to analyze, to provide recommendations, and to help us in designing a next generation network infrastructure, and also lay a foundation for smart city applications. Today, we'll just look at the overview of how we plan to connect, how we plan to phase this project into production, and also to look at some of the initiatives that will help us in being a smart city. We looked at doing a smart pole pilot, and then also working with a disaster recovery plan that will help us secure our information and provide us with an opportunity to not just house our information within the city as we do now, but at a location that can withstand hurricanes and those type of activity. The next generation network will provide us in the city, they allow us to use our own fiber infrastructure and build a platform that will help us reduce telecom costs and provide a way for us to start our digital transformation. And a digital transformation for us, what that means is we will use digital applications to enhance city services, communication with our citizens, and to help us with city government. The circuit that we plan to use will allow us in the city of Hampton to utilize speeds of 2 gigabit, scalable up to 100 gigabit, which will enhance a lot of what we're trying to do here in the city with reference to cameras and sensors and things like that to collect data so we can make better decisions. We will work with Metro Fiber Networks that will allow us to use our existing agreements with them to help us build that infrastructure within the city.
Question, what are Metro Fiber?
That's a vendor here on the peninsula that deals with fiber connectivity. They actually have the connection from, I think it's Yorktown, all the way through to the cable landing station in Virginia Beach. And we're going to connect with them to make a connection here. The project will be split into 3 phases. The initial phase will be to provide connectivity here to the City Hall building, and the phase 2 and 3 will expand westward and eastward. And phase 1 for us is slated to begin in December or next month. What we will do there is connect from here, the point in Fort Monroe, where the cables transverse. We'll connect from there to City Hall, and the connectivity for us will provide a cheaper cost for our circuits, and will allow us to easily expand our next generation network. Our connectivity to the cable landing station will allow the service providers, it would be competitive for them to work with us as we move forward with the connectivity. The connectivity to the cable landing stations will also allow us to access the main data center up in Ashland, Virginia, and in Richmond, and that will allow us to also build our disaster recovery plan as well, so we can secure our information there. It also allows us to be part of a global research initiative along with HIRES and other localities. There's a global research initiative where locations around the world can access data. Well, by us connecting to the cable landing in Virginia Beach, we will have access to do that.
So if the cable landing station at Fort Monroe is connected, is that connected to the broadband network that they're building on the south side?
Yes.
And it comes across the bay and with a cable landing station at Fort Monroe, and then I guess that's where the peninsula gets connected?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So as you can see, the cable landing, it does come from Virginia Beach, it runs through Fort Monroe and moves north to Richmond and further north. So this diagram here will give you an idea of how the cable runs and how we will connect to it. We would just have to connect to the orange cable, and that will allow us to populate the activity through our facilities in the city. Overall, we have 72 buildings with 123 facilities, and that's what we plan to connect. Again, we're going to do it in phases. First phase, we have 28 buildings, 68 facilities. And here you can see a list of all of the buildings that we'll connect, which are highlighted, and the facilities that are connected through them. So this will be in phase 1. Phase 2 will move out westward of the city, 30 buildings, 38 facilities. While we're moving outward, we're also going to plan our infrastructure that will also have in proximity opportunity zones, corporate parks, and business improvement districts, which allows the potential for that access as well. Phase 2, these are the buildings that we will connect that are highlighted and the associated facilities with that. And phase 3 will feature Fort Monroe, Phoebus, and Buckrow, and that's how we will connect. Again, the buildings and the facilities associated with that. Along with what we're trying to do with the infrastructure, we wanted to bring in and look at applications that will help us build our smart city program. Initially, we looked at a smart pole, light pole pilot. Now, the benefits of smart poles, they're solar powered. They come in modular design, various sizes, and they have different types of functionality that we can include. We can include cameras. We can include various sensors, that proximity sensors, directional sensors. Also, we can include charging apparatus so people can charge their mobile devices. They will also have apparatus that can detect gunshots if something happens, and also automobile tag recognition. When we first looked at opportunities for the smart poles, we looked at downtown Hampton, Phoebus, and other key areas to try the pilot. And here is just a slide that shows you the return on investment that we will see if implementing these poles within the city. Generally, there's no connectivity to Dominion Energy to make the poles work. They're solar powered. So they will last a lot longer than your normal light poles.
Excuse me, Vice Mayor, Dr. Davis?
Yes.
With the smart poles, strategically, are they located throughout the city? Where?
I'm going to show you in just a second.
All right, thank you.
To look at what we did, we worked with the police department. We worked with Public Works and Parks and Recreation to look at different areas that might facilitate the use of these smart poles. We looked at Queensway, 4 poles there, the Hampton History Museum on Old Hampton Lane. We looked at poles there, and then we looked at retrofitting poles on the Mellon Street Bridge, 5 poles in the Phoebus parking lot, and I will show you where those poles will be located. And then poles at the Wise Thomas Community Center Park Trail. After the discussion and after walking through all of those different areas, we felt that Wise Thomas Community Center Park would be the ideal location to do our pilot. Here is the Wise Thomas Community Center Park Trail. The red dots will show where the lights will be located along the trail. In the poles, we would have panic buttons with bidirectional calling. We would have follow me sensors for adjustable lighting. So if there's activity in the park, the lights will brighten. If there's no activity, they will dim, conserving energy. We will also include Wi-Fi access. So whoever's in the park can have access to Wi-Fi.
So would it be the goal to extend this throughout the entire city? These are pilot?
This is a pilot initiative. If it works for us, then we will start looking at other locations to.
I like the idea.
To bring it on.
Yeah, thank you.
If you look at the 2 large trees in the center of the park by the baseball diamond, we will place the Wi-Fi access there that would be bidirectional, so you could get it from either side. And with this, we will be able to, if we go forward with this particular pilot, we can have this implemented and completed by the end of December. And these are some of the pictures, as I said, of where we would locate the lights on the different areas. Okay, on Queensway, you can see where we would place the 4 light poles. The History Museum and the parking garage, you can see how we would place the light poles if we went there. On the Mellon Bridge, we would retrofit 3 of the light poles located there.
Councilman Brown.
Yeah. I think I see it now. 3 existing poles.
Yes.
So the smart pole pilot program are poles that are already existing in the city, or you're adding new poles as well?
We will be adding the smart poles.
Okay.
Here, these are existing poles that we can retrofit with the technology.
Okay, good.
The YH Thomas one, they don't have lighting right now, which is why we were looking at as the pilot project, because that would be a completely new installation. Mr. McCauley was already working with the YH Thomas board to get them lighting. This is something we could be a really good test for us with these smart pole lights. A lot of times when you're working with the traditional lights, they take much longer for installation when working through the Dominion Power process. So we thought the YH Thomas one, being something that Parks was already going to invest in, would be ideal for the test. You may also recall that we have a program that we fund each year in the budget process to add additional street lighting through our public safety initiative, where we have neighborhoods that are darker. And in the old days, when we put up street lights, we put them up for traffic safety only. But as we've gotten more dense as a community and stuff, and there's been more concern from individuals that lighting makes them feel safer, the traffic lights that you have on your typical streets weren't designed for that perception of safety. They were designed only to provide traffic lighting. So several years ago, we started putting money in the budget each year. I believe it was $100,000 a year, and we've built up to $400,000 or $500,000 where we can go in and put in lights in neighborhoods to enhance that safety lighting, for lack of a better word. So if this pilot works well for us in YH Thomas, we would then look to do more deployment using that public safety lighting program that we're already funding. So this is not something we're thinking requires a new investment of money, but rather using the money we already have in a smarter way with the new technologies.
Yeah, Mary, because as you know, and thank you for that update as well, we often hear communities complain about no lighting or very minimal lighting. And so I hope that as this program, I believe it's going to be successful, that we can prioritize and make sure that, this stays at the forefront of at least satisfying that customer service need from our citizens.
Absolutely. That's the thought. Once we test these, this might be the smarter way to go in terms of deploying that, because you get so much more out of these smart poles, as you heard from Wayne, in terms of some of the data that you can get. So Dominion Power is doing smart lighting as they change out old lights. The sodium vapor lights that have been traditionally used are no longer being manufactured, and over time they're converting to LED installations. But and because they're doing a lot of that, it's a lot harder for us to get new poles up as quickly as we want. So if this works well, we could work in concert with Dominion Energy to get a deployment much quicker and in the areas that we were already going to target for public safety lighting.
Councilwoman Curtis.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Dr. Davis, you heard the previous presentation where the chief was talking about.
Yes.
We were talking about signs about cameras and red light cameras. Is it possible that some of these smart poles could be installed to give us some of that information? Could that be a possible assistance to the police division in trying to get this traffic situation sorted out?
The potential is there. It depends on what type of sensors that we use for that.
Right.
But the possibility is there, yeah.
Wow. Rarely do two presentations dovetail so nicely. I think that's great. But thank you. That's a great thought.
Mm-hmm. Our disaster recovery plan, as I said earlier, we do have a disaster recovery plan in place now, but furthering and enhancing that with the new connectivity that we will have, by us connecting to the cables at the cable landing station in Virginia Beach, like I said, will provide us a connection to the data center up in Richmond. It's easier now to house our data in the cloud. If you have equipment, hardwired equipment, there's a possibility or potential for failure. as we move to the cloud, it's a more secure location. It will help us not to rely on equipment. But this recovery plan here is a new one. The city of Hampton is piloting this, and as you can see, as discussions have gone on with the South Side, as we move forward with our process to build our disaster recovery plan, Norfolk and Virginia Beach want to come along with us, so we're going to bring them along. But we will be leading this effort as far as disaster recovery plan. It's a replicable plan that can be completed throughout the whole region, but we will be the first to do it. Thank you, and if there are any other questions, I can take them.
Again, this was mostly for your information and to show you the good work that our IT department's doing to stay on the cutting edge and to make you aware that unless you have objections, we want to move forward with the pilot efforts that were described, and we'll certainly keep you posted.
And City Manager, I have one question for Mr. Davis regarding the first half of the presentation on the network build out. And, you know, I know at one time when police and then subsequently the fire department were implementing mobile data terminals for their vehicles, which I'm sure they're already being used now. But I'm not exactly sure what network those terminals are operating on now, and if it's a system that we're paying for data use on Verizon or one of those, or will there be a cost savings associated with this? Because we were also speaking at one time about building out a fiber ring around the city so that all of that technology could ride on that fiber ring. So is this where we're going with that? And is there cost savings for, you know, what we're currently paying now and what we will be paying once that system is implemented?
Yes, sir. That is the goal that we set out for. As we move forward with this new infrastructure, the connectivity that the police now have will be connected to that. There will be some cost savings, and I can tell you after what that will be, but there will be considerable cost savings. And that was the whole goal behind this whole project, is to see what we could do to have cost savings for the city.
Okay. And then the second question is, this year, well, in the current year's budget, we approved a solid waste fee increase for technology, smart technology, I think, for Public Works to be able to do a lot of things with, you know, reporting potholes, trash cans missed, and those kinds of things. So how much does that technology implementation rely on the network that you're implementing in the city now?
I don't think that it relies, you have to have what Wayne's talking about to do that, but I think when this is all built out, similar to what your description of the fire engines and the police cars, we won't be having to pay basically a cellular data plan to be able to have the connectivity. So that project, by the way, has already been bid, and the bids are being analyzed, the solid waste trucks. So that one's moving forward and will be implemented before this whole network is built out. But presumably the same cost efficiencies that you would get with the police and fire engines, you would be able to get with the solid waste vehicles in time.
And I'm working with Public Works on that project as well.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Davis? Okay. Thank you. Very informative presentation.
Thank you.
All right, and then the final presentation for the afternoon, City Manager?
Yes, as you know, over the last several months, we have been coming and updating you on each of your strategic priorities. The last of the strategic priorities, and I say last because it's not least important, but it's just the last one that we've gotten to present to you, is the family resilience and economic empowerment. And Wanda Rogers, our Director of Hampton Human Services, is going to be taking the lead role in this presentation today. The goal of all these strategic planning presentations, again, has been to remind you and the community not only of the importance of each of the goals, but the strategies that here to date have been approved and the accomplishment of strategies to date. And all of this is in preparation for us as we do continued community development work and as we enter into the budget season. So hopefully these have been informative, and I'm sure Ms. Rogers will be equally as informative as the prior ones.
So good afternoon, Vice Mayor, City Manager Bunting, Attorney Ivory, and distinguished council members. Thank you for the opportunity. Across the state and actually nationally right now, there are robust conversations happening about family resilience and economic empowerment. And so we are trying to be as much a part of those conversations as possible to make sure that the citizens in Hampton will have the very best services possible. So, 032619 has become somewhat of a tagline for us at the Department of Human Services. It is, in our minds, the numbers that represent the month, the day, and the year that Hampton came together in an amazing way to change forever how we are going to respond to family resilience and economic empowerment. We consider it to be the day that a breakthrough happened. Many of you all were there at the department. We had the mayor there, we had the city manager, we had department heads, we had private providers, the state was there, Thomas Nelson was there, our universities were there, and it is the day that we decided that everybody in our city who is living at or below 200% of the federal poverty level would have an opportunity to be served. We were able to do this because of a very small grant that we received, but we're excited nonetheless. We were also very excited because I have been talking to a number of employees and some of you about the Human Services Value Curve. And so the Human Services Value Curve is a framework that has helped us to decide on the approach that we are now using. It is a framework that has given us new energy, and it talks about the regulative space versus the collaborative space versus the integrative space, and then finally the generative space, which is my favorite. And so the future of Hampton in regards to family resilience and economic empowerment is absolutely going to be a whole family approach. It is going to be an approach that looks at career paths. It is going to be concrete connections for those individuals that we are serving. It is their story, their plan, and they will have access and opportunity to what they are in need of. And so Mr. P and his daughters are already on their way to reaching their full potential because of the work that we're doing. So what is this Human Services Value Curve that has gotten us pretty excited? It is, as I mentioned, a framework And it gives us the opportunity to be less regulatory. As you know, many of our programs are connected to so many rules and regulations that it is difficult to have the impact that we are seeking. It allows us to be more collaborative. It allows us to integrate. And finally, it allows us to be generative. And so that is the most exciting part, because when we talk generative, the focus is on generating healthy communities, not just working in silos, but working across departments to make sure that we are co-creating solutions for multidimensional family and socioeconomic challenges as well as opportunities. So we are absolutely excited to have used the Human Services Value Curve as our framework. What we have also been able to do is to begin to reimagine what our vision will be. We want service delivery, and we want to implement whole family approaches, and absolutely we want the outcomes to be positive. You all already know that we work really hard to ensure that all of our Hampton families are able to become healthy and self-sufficient, but we are beginning now to ask the question, what is self-sufficiency? What does that really mean? And how many people are actually self-sufficient? So as we think about the whole notion of self-sufficiency, we have also begun to think about doing our work from the lens of moving upstream, our root causes, our barriers, our enablers. And so I shared just a little bit at the bottom about how the human services have often focused on helping people downstream. They help people when there is a crisis, or midstream. They assist families during a challenging time. But upstream work addresses what we like to think of as the root causes. It helps us to look at the barriers, and then it enables healthy families and thriving communities. So, serving 27,561 individuals daily. I will tell you that most of the individuals in this number are living at or below the federal 200% of the federal poverty level. And while we mostly agree that we have amazing partnerships in our community, the question for us really becomes, are we really working with families living in poverty? Or are we just providing benefits to them? Some of those benefits you're aware of, the SNAP benefits, the Medicaid benefits, the TANF benefits, and child care benefits. We're beginning to ask, what happens to families after they leave us? And then, of course, we are continuing to ask, is anybody better off because of us? What we know for sure is that we are trying to solve some very complex social problems with antiquated programs that have not changed for 20 years. And so our partners are really going to matter as we begin to do this work and we begin to think outside of the box. And so while I haven't listed all of our partners, I think it is pretty impressive that surrounding any family in Hampton, there are all of these services that they can potentially be a part of. So these next 3 slides, I actually think you all have seen these slides before. These slides were provided by our economic development team, and it actually talks to us about what are some of the employment industries in our city. What are some of the unemployment rate comparisons that we need to be paying attention to? And then what are the activities that we are working together on to ensure that there are job skills that are provided when needed, there are training skills that are there. We are keeping our sights set on what is really available in our community to help people achieve economic success. And then we are also keeping our eye on the things that do not now exist that we absolutely need to work on in order to assure that there is an opportunity for people to reach their goals. Our top priorities are, of course, something that we've begun to take a look at when we think about our work, whether it's prevention, and many of you all know our prevention work, our Healthy Start, our infant and toddler connection, our parenting classes and those workshops, our play groups, our school-age programs, or our intervention programs, and many of you know those as well, our Children's Services Act, our Child Protective Services, our foster care and adoption services, child custody investigations, adult protection and community care, employment services, or financial benefits. Our top priorities in all of the work that we do is absolutely focused in 3 areas: achieving outcomes and results, achieving family, economic, and social well-being, and then this whole family approach that is going to ensure, hopefully, that this page, which has probably about 75 services, that these services are aligned, that we're not working in silos, that we're putting around families, and as you saw in the earlier slide, paying attention to families being at the center and making sure that all of these services will support them. And so this complement of services and supports is extremely important to our family resilience work. We are thinking strengths-based when we think of family resilience. We're thinking about our citizens' ability to overcome adversity. We're thinking about understanding risks that are prevalent in their situations. We certainly want to have some emphasis on stress management, emotion regulation, collaborative goal setting, and also problem solving. And so these services, as they are listed, all have features that would allow us to do that family resilience work. And so as we break through to where we feel is going to be a cutting edge way of doing this work, we know that as challenges become more complex, our responses will need to become more complex. We are also committed to working across boundaries, sharing data and ideas that will build new solutions, and of course, getting to the root causes. Our challenges are many, but there is one thing that is crystal clear for us: that we have to make sure that that we tip the scale for positive outcomes for whole families. And so we have decided that that means supportive relationships and active skill building that strengthen the foundation for resilience. And again, as we think about how complex the challenges have become for us, we also think about the innovation that is going to be required. We know that we have to work across those boundaries, and we know we have to come up with new ways of doing this work. As we identify and we advance the policies that govern our system, we know that we have got to do a better better job at looking at the root causes of social and economic mobility, and that we need to redesign programs that will be more equitable and that our citizens will finally be able to thrive. So as we think about what our challenges are going to be, we often think about public assistance recipients who work. And so many of you have heard me talk about the personal responsibility that is attached to any of the benefits that we provide. And so our benefits customers often find themselves headed to what we call the benefits cliff. They're dangling just like this guy in this slide. And so what is the benefits cliff? The benefits cliff is the term that we use that describes what happens when people's public benefits programs phase down or phase out, leading to an abrupt reduction or loss of their benefits for individuals and as they are trying to work to earn money. So when their earnings increase but have not increased enough for self-sufficiency to be reached, they find themselves on this benefits cliff. So we are planning to continue to work with our federal and our state partners around blending and braiding funding. We are encouraged that the federal government has decided that child support needs to also talk to child care, needs to also talk to TANF, needs to also talk to HUD, needs to get out of their offices and come together, take a look at the pot of money that is in place to support people who are living in poverty and who need economic opportunities. And so I am very, very encouraged that those conversations are happening with our federal partners. We also know that with all of these different departments, there are various requirements across the programs that cause people to just find themselves on this cliff. They're required to work, but they've done the math. Oftentimes when they get a job that is maybe paying $15 an hour, but without any type of benefits, they then lose their child care, which provides a tremendous amount of support to families who are trying to go to work, and then trying to take care of the child care often makes them realize that they certainly don't even have, money left to meet the bare necessities. And so then the child care goes away. As their income creeps up a little bit further, then the SNAP goes away. The TANF goes away, and so it just puts them in a very awkward spot in terms of how do I actually make this employment become self-supporting. And so that is the challenge that we have decided to address, and that is what we will be working with our families to take a look at. And so what does the future of Hampton look like? It looks like all of these things to us. It is exciting. It is holistic. Preventions and interventions that will help all of the Mr. P's and Mrs. P's and their families and the children to reach their full potential. And so I know that there is one member of council who especially likes outcome information. And so I am going to do outcomes a little bit different today. I would like to talk about outcomes in the way that we are going to try to talk about outcomes moving forward. And it is from the generative space. With the generative space, we feel that the issues in our community belong to the entire community. And so we are going to start doing our work work, as we have done with many of our children and family programs, by doing it from a more generative look. So what I will share with you is that in the city of Hampton, when we look at outcomes from a generative lens, there is a stakeholders group comprised of the schools, comprised of human services, comprised of court services and the courts, comprised of the Hampton Newport News Community Services Board, comprised of the Hampton Health Department, comprised of private providers and all of our partners. Each one of those stakeholders is accountable for positive outcomes for the children and families that we have been serving now, we think, pretty successfully for almost 2 decades using that generative approach. And so 92% of the outcomes are positive. We say 92% because that's what the data says, but we actually feel that it's higher than that because we have our own internal processes where we are able to look at what's happening with our families. And so if they're not making progress in a positive direction, we decide that we will change focus. We will not just keep doing more of the same thing that is not working. And so with the data that the state provides, so this 92% of our outcomes are positive. And then I'd like to share with you that the 8% that are not positive outcomes are the ones that keep us up at night, where we are asking questions of each other, such as what did we miss? What needs to be created in our community that does not now exist? How do we keep getting better? And we also have made a commitment to train together as often as possible, but we try to make that happen at least annually. So our new family resilience and economic empowerment lens has thus far led to the following outcomes. We have a fully operationalized group of stakeholders addressing poverty in ways that support whole families. This doesn't sound huge when I say it, but to me, it is really huge. We have 2 champions of the 2-generation approach to poverty. What we have learned over time is that the best work gets done when there are individuals who are willing to champion the effort. And to have 2, considering that we just got started recently, is impressive to us. And so we are absolutely seeking others. And then we have created capacity for at least 6 individual engagement sessions per week, where we are able to develop individualized plans and individualized paths to economic empowerment. We are absolutely excited about being able to help the families in our community become economically empowered and remain resilient families. Are there questions?
Councilman Brown.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Wanda, for your presentation. Just a couple of questions. First of all, outstanding. I love what you're doing in the human services. Have you guys considered or have looked at the poverty study done by Peninsula Community Foundation? And how do you all kind of retrofit with some of the outcomes, some of the research that they've done on poverty in the Hampton community, Hampton Roads community?
So they are not listed on my chart, but we are at the table with the Peninsula Community Foundation working together on what poverty looks like in our community and what our responses need to be.
Okay. And the other question is, in my experience, working with folks and trying to get them to a position of self-sufficiency, getting them placement in jobs and all, this is the problem that I see, is that we don't do enough on financial literacy. Because if someone gets employed and now they're losing their food stamps, or they're losing daycare subsidies and the like, how do we help them with to budget and understand the power of this? I use the word new money, because now they are less dependent on government assistance and really kind of need some financial literacy. Are you guys instilling any training in that area, folks with budgeting and the daily living needs?
Absolutely. I would be remiss if I did not say that we have for a number of years been doing training around financial literacy, around preparing individuals to become job ready. Mm-hmm. And what we now need to be able to do is to help people to become economically empowered. We need to be able to work through that cliff that I talked about to help people understand what it is going to take right up front in order for them to be able to make it as we back out the support that is provided now through the Department of Human Services and the benefits program. So yes, we partner with individuals in our community to do that. One of our main partners is the Center for Child and Family Services around financial literacy, and they are willing to do that with each individual that we will serve.
Councilwoman Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. Wanda, how do you define the ultimate success for a family that comes into human services? How do you define? I know that you have lots of little steps along the way, but what's the ultimate goal?
So there are different ways that we define that. We try to ensure that the conditions that brought the family to our table in the first place are the things that we concentrate on initially. And so in this economic empowerment type of work, we're going to be starting with an assessment. When I talked with you all last, I talked about how we are now beginning to compare our families to what we were using in Safe and Clean as the broken window syndrome. And so what we are going to be doing is making sure that through the assessment, we understand where the small things happened and when they happened that went unaddressed that have now led to major problems for the individual. So when I talk about families, I talk about, have we done the assessment so that we know your story? Have we done an assessment so that we are able to then sit with you and plan what is your goal and how is it that we can help you to accomplish that goal? And so initially it might be, well, I'm not even really ready to work with you all on economic empowerment. I need a place to stay. And so we would then work on making sure that the housing issue is addressed. Once we get the housing issue addressed, then we might move into, okay, so now that you have housing, what is your plan to be able to continue to afford, this housing? We have assisted you in getting it done. Are you going to continue to be able to manage? And so that's where some of the the financial literacy counseling would come in. And then as we look at that, what is going on with your family as a whole? And what are your goals? Are you trying to make sure that your children all successfully complete elementary school? And how can we help you to do that? Our work generally looks like that. The goal that we have identified with the family, and then the steps to achieve that, and then what is next. And then ultimately, we hope that families will be able to make it without the support of the organization, but we always share with them that if new things come up, they need to reach out to us again.
So what you're saying is that ultimately your goal is for a family to be self-sufficient and perhaps not reliant on your services. That's kind of the goal at the end. With all these other steps in the middle, that's your goal at the end.
I think self-sufficient is something that we're beginning to look at now. And so, yes, that is what we have been working on in the past. But what I think we're trying to do is to replace the Department of Human Services with the natural supports that we are able to find within the family and within the community for those individuals, so that they now have supports that are outside of the human services realm and that are more natural, like extended family members, maybe community affiliations, maybe faith-based connections, all those kinds of things that will allow them to be able to keep moving forward.
So, I'm sorry, I want to get clarity on this.
Yes.
So I know that your approach changed in March because I was there at your
Yes.
wonderful presentation. So do you have I would assume that you have data from prior to your institution of this new approach, and that you will be able to compare over time. And I'm not saying at all that I expect anything overnight, because I know it doesn't work that way. But 3 years from now, 5 years from now, you'll be able to say, up until March of 19, we were successfully transitioning X percent of our families out of our services. And after that, with the programs and approaches that we instituted on that date, we're going to have hopefully different data.
Yes.
Okay.
What we know for sure is that the way we were working before, we were getting jobs for individuals, but we were not necessarily helping them to achieve self-sufficiency. So our data, and supported by the state, will now be able to look at how people are moving toward economic mobility.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Councilwoman Sneed.
Wanda, I really liked your presentation a lot, but I'm still outcome-based.
Yes.
So, and I want to take a different approach to outcomes, because from my perspective, have you all identified what success looks like for a family? Let's say a family of 4. For a family of 4 to be self-sufficient, how much income does it take? How much, there are certain parameters that take place that determine self-sufficiency,
Sure.
And so I don't know if you all have gotten to that point where you've identified what those markers are that would determine what your success would be, because moving them out of your programs doesn't necessarily mean success and self-sufficiency.
Bingo.
But how many children, in that particular family have gone on to careers, or what type of jobs the parents have gotten? Have they become homeownership, or are they living in living in subsidized housing, or are they living in housing that is, the average housing type thing? And we have to determine, I think, as a community, what self-sufficiency means for us to help us move our needle. And so I don't know if that's been done yet, because I would like for you to come back at some point and report to me that you've had families that have come in making $20,000 a year, and now through your help and assistance, and this could be maybe 5 or 6 years down the road. I don't know how long it takes, but you've now have this many families that have progressed to income levels much higher than that, and they've done, these particular things. To me, that is self-sufficiency. Per se. So I just don't know where you are.
I appreciate those comments, and I think it is going to require a longitudinal study at some point to determine where we were and where we are. Today, I was very careful not to say to you that I have a success story, because from March till now is not an indicator of success the way we're working right now. My team members will often say to me, "Oh, wow, you're going to be so happy that Miss G got a job and she's making $30 an hour." And I say, I am happy, but does she have benefits? Is it full or part-time? How many hours is she getting? And so we're beginning to look at our work from that angle so that we will be able to say, and so how did this move the needle for her and her family? Is it all now going into child care? And, are they still hungry? Those kinds of things, Ms. Sneed, are the things that we will have to do. And I will tell you that I am following one case right now. I am following that case because things just keep coming up in that case that we need to do. And I am trying to gauge how successful we are at meeting everything that comes up. And so the lessons that we learn from that family, we may be able to use them for another family, but our next family may have none of those issues. And so we will need to then determine what else we need to create in our community. So where I am focused is trying to be able to identify for you all, because I do have what most of my team thinks are success stories, but I don't know yet, because were we able to sustain that level of sufficiency for a period of time? And to me, that is what really determines how successful this work is.
Maybe at some point we may come back and say we can't call it self-sufficiency.
Yeah.
We may have to call it something else.
Right.
But until we come up with benchmarks that determine that for this community, we really don't know whether we're successful or not,
Exactly. Until I can say to you, everybody that was living at 200% below the federal poverty level is now in a job that is able to meet their particular situation. There is still so much work to do. So when we took this on, we realized that it was a huge challenge. I think that people are so accustomed to wanting quick results that it really does take some work. And like I said, champions who understand that it's not going to be quick, but it needs to be continuous, and we need to be able to report out to you all and to the community what we're doing to ensure that people are not living in poverty.
Even if you come up with, you have 40, 50, I don't know how many families that are at 200% below poverty, but some have shifted up to maybe 100%, 150, whatever, some progression to show that we're going in the right direction. That's what I'd like to see, to make sure that what we say we're doing, we're actually getting some results from.
Yes, ma'am.
Councilman Brown.
Thank you again, Wanda. When I think about self-sufficiency, Wanda, I think self-sufficiency is self-defined. People have different definitions of what self-sufficiency really is. I like to, Councilwoman Sneed maybe indicated, maybe we look at a different phrase or word. I like to look at what I call holistic, balanced, and centered. For folks who look at the whole balance of it, job, benefits, education, advanced education, home ownership. I think if we can look at it from a well-balanced, centered individual, that person will have a degree of self-sufficiency. Because we meet people in my work every day who have home ownership, but next month they're on the verge of bankruptcy and or foreclosure. So I think, again, we go back to how do we make that person balanced and centered, and help them say to us, I'm self-sufficient because. And what are those, what is your definition? Talk to the person now of self-sufficiency. And they'll say to me, if I can do A, B, and C, I'm good. So I think we have to self-define what that is. And sometimes I don't know if the measurements are there. You can measure some successes, but some you can't. And so to come back with a picture of John Doe before and after, sometimes that's possible, sometimes it isn't. But I think self-sufficiency is a word that we've thrown around, we've used very loosely, very lightly, but to get people to a well-balanced, centered life holistically, I think that's probably what we should be looking at. That's just my commentary.
Thank you so much for those comments. I think that is also what the federal government is looking at. It is amazing to hear them say that what we've done for 20 years was more entrapment than, actually helping people to move forward. And so being willing to turn that on its head, to be able to try to do just what you just talked about, where people get to say, this is the balance that I'm seeking.
Councilmember Sneed.
Okay, I got one more thing. Okay. Yes, that's true, what Councilman Brown said. But to me, it's about poverty, getting people out of poverty. Because until you get people out of poverty, I don't see how you can become self-sufficient. You can't. There's got to be some mechanism in place, and I think you can identify that. And the way perhaps we could do that is come up with what a portrait of a self-sufficient family would look like, sort of what we say about a graduate. Now, everybody can't make the same salary because people don't have the same skill levels, Some people make a lot of money, they have lots of student debt, they have, and so if you ask them, they'd say, a lot of our young people say, I'm not self-sufficient, and stuff. But if you truly look at where the poverty is, and the goal is to try to raise up the people in your community so that they can rely less on what you pay out and become more self-sufficient. And so that to me, I think conversation needs to be had to define that, and that's why when I say maybe self-sufficient isn't the word, I don't know. But to me, that's the goal, was to get people out of poverty.
That's very helpful because there are some poverty guidelines. And so we will absolutely be able to tell when we have moved people from, for a household of one, 100% of the federal poverty level is $12,060. 200% of that is $24,120. So it's easy enough for us to be able to look at what we've done around that 200% of the federal poverty level. Yes.
$12,000 is way below poverty. I think we should come up with something that we aspire for. There's nothing wrong with stretching. I've been taught all my career that we should stretch. And if we don't try to stretch as a community and try to work towards improving our citizens who happen to be the least of these right now, then, we need not even do this, So
Absolutely.
I'm just feeling that we should try to really look at some realistic what it takes to live. The federal government is not giving, to me, the appropriate amount of money that it takes to live and work and have a good quality of life in a city. So I just want to throw that out, and I'm done. I won't say anything else about this.
So Wanda didn't mention it. She was using the federal poverty guidelines because that's what they get measured on in their departments. But I know you all are all familiar, as is Wanda, and Wanda and her team look at it, the work that's generally abbreviated to ALICE. It's basically what it really does take to live. It looks at, housing cost, utility cost, food cost, et cetera. And the ALICE measures are higher than those federal poverty guidelines. And that's something that the United Way has worked with all of those same agencies that were up there to define. So WANDA legally has to track to poverty guidelines for the state and federal government requirements, but additionally we can use those ALICE measures, and maybe those are different benchmarks. The first benchmark is getting you out of the poverty deadline. The next benchmark is getting you to ALICE living, and then so forth and so on. But that way, if we are using those quantifiable goals, we can come back and track for you. X many people have moved out of Category 1 into Category 2. Now we're working to get them to Category 3. I think that's what you're describing.
That's exactly what I'm looking for.
Okay.
That we can do that.
Okay, so, when we started this priority for council, the goal was to move families out of poverty and into self-sufficiency. So I guess somehow we got to figure out how to define what self-sufficiency means. And so going back to what I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, but I would like to see, perhaps the next presentation would be, here is how we have defined that, and if it's in the form of tiers or phases or categories of self-sufficiency that we're trying to get to, then here's now how we're measuring that. Because what we really want to see at the end are some outcomes. And so let's, perhaps a future presentation, not too far down the road, we'll come back and look at what the measurements are, so that we begin to see how. And then, Wanda, I know you mentioned early on in your presentation, you said that there were 27,000 individuals receiving services.
Yes.
But the presentation was kind of around families. And so I don't know how those 27,000 break down into so many families, but it would be helpful to know the numbers in terms of families that are living in poverty and in receiving services, so that we can know that that's the group that we want to measure, since the focus is going to be on families.
And we will certainly do the work you've just outlined and come back. I do want to say that I think part of the answer, in addition to tiers, maybe taking sort of a version of what both Councilwoman Snead and Councilman Brown said, and developing, because it is different for each person, and each person should have some role in defining that for themselves, as opposed to having government dictate to them, this is precisely what it looks like to be, self-sufficient. And we do want to involve people in the development of their own goals and priorities, because the research shows that when they own those, they are going to be more successful, as opposed to people setting them for themselves. Mm-hmm. But I like this notion of a portrait of a self-sufficient individual to guide those conversations, and thinking, as Councilwoman Snead mentioned, about like the portrait of a graduate. Every high school graduate looks somewhat different, but the high school has defined categories of success to guide those conversations and plot the career and college plans for students. So it may be we can do something very similar with self-sufficiency that gets at the wholeness of what that looks like, but isn't so directive that it's government telling people what that looks like. And it helps to guide those conversations so that the customers are a part of defining their own goals, so that they own them and embrace them. And yet we don't lose sight of one of the fundamentals has got to be we've got to get you to a place where you're earning enough money that you can take care of your basic needs as an individual or as a family. So I think there's a lot of good work that's come out of today's conversation that we can go back and build on, coming back, say, in early 2020 with an updated presentation.
That would be great. Thank you. Thanks
Good
for a great
job,
presentation, Wanda.
Thank you.
As always.
Thank you.
Okay, that concludes all of our presentations for the afternoon session, unless the manager has something else to add.
Sir.
So are there any regional issues? Any new business? Okay, with that, we will go into closed session. I'd like to ask the clerk to read the motion to convene a closed session.
The motion required is to convene a closed session pursuant to Virginia Code Sections 2.2-3711.A.1, .3, .6, .7, and .8 to discuss appointments as indicated on the agenda, discussion or consideration of the acquisition of real property for a public purpose in the Wythe, Coliseum Central, and downtown areas of the city, where discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect the bargaining position or negotiating strategy of the public body. Discussion or consideration of the investment of public funds where competition or bargaining is involved, where, if made public initially, the financial interest of the governmental unit would be adversely affected. Consultation with legal counsel pertaining to actual or probable litigation, where such consultation or briefing in an open meeting would adversely affect the negotiating or litigation posture of the public body, and for consultation with legal counsel employed or retained by a public body regarding specific legal matters related to coastal resiliency efforts, requiring the provision of legal advice by such counsel.
So moved.
Second.
Councilwoman Brown?
Aye.
Councilman Brown?
Aye.
Councilwoman Curtis?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Gray?
Aye.
Councilman Hobbs?
Aye.
Councilwoman Sneed?
Aye.
Mayor Tuck?
Okay, so we will reconvene in the Lawson for the closed session at 3:10, and this meeting is adjourned.